We have taken a look at Columbus and the coincidences, if you will, that came together that produced this uh, newfound European interest, not just Columbus and, of course, Spain, but now the other powers were getting involved in the quote unquote New World. Again, to recap, we talked about uh, the coming together of new inventions for exploring, navigation, better ships, making it a little bit easier. Uh, the invention of the printing press, which now disseminated all this information, which allowed people to get interested in ways that they didn't find possible before. They now knew what each other was doing, and that helped to fuel this newfound interest. And then, of course, there was the necessity for this exploration, the need for money. Money was at an all-time low in comparison to the growing population worldwide. And because money was back then hard currency, in other words, it was either gold, silver, or uh, precious stones of some type, it wasn't easy to make more money. It's not like today when you can just put it on a printing press and crank out the dollars that you need. This was a little bit more difficult, so it had to be found. And that was the impetus behind many of these adventures into the New World. So we're going to take a look at them all coming to America for various and sundry reasons. We'll concentrate today on the English, the French, and the Dutch, and see what led to their experiments in the New World. Now, we already know that Spain was in here, and basically, as you see on the screen, Spain was not interested in colonizing. Uh, she did not have a population that suffered from tremendous religious persecution. She did not have a population that was mired in poverty, uh, and she definitely was not overcrowded. So, most people in Spain were very content to stay in Spain, except, of course, for the treasure hunters, the conquistadors that we've already talked about, uh, as they made the discoveries of the New World pay handsomely for Spain. Now, the French, on the other hand, a few colonists came over here, uh, but again, they were not looking to start a new life in terms of farming or fishing. They were interested in the riches that this new world had to give. And among them were furs. And that's going to become big business. And the middleman in all of this were going to be the Indians. The French, unlike the Spanish, from the very beginning, the French were very cooperative and very alliance conscious, if you will, with the Indians. The problem that they're going to have is that they hook up with the wrong Indians. Instead of the Iroquois, which at that time and for uh, many years to come would be the major power in the New World, uh, they are going to get together with the Hurons from the Midwest, the Michigan, Minnesota area, and that was going to prove to be a mistake that they could not possibly have foreseen unless you knew the diplomacy that existed in that area. Now, the Dutch, they are going to set up a feudal land system along the Hudson Valley. So you do have some colonists, but it was the few making it very difficult for the many. They were bringing over their old style of land system where one patroon, one baron, if you will, would control all of the land and then lease it out. And that's how they made their money. So we see that trade, religion, national power are all reasons for exploration. And these, the colonies or the colonists, if you will, had in common. But that commonality was not going to produce a peaceful resolution to these. You're going to find that many of the explorers that are coming over here are searching for that mythical Northwest Passage. For eons, or at least decades, uh, North America was seen as uh, a blockage. So how can we find that mythical water route through North America that'll take us directly to Asia? Searching out that quick route to Asia that, of course, had prompted Columbus to take his original voyage. The colonies start becoming permanent when England decides that this is the way to go. Initially, you had fishing stations established by some of the European colonists, particularly the French, right? But after that, uh, you're going to have the beginnings of what you now know today as modern corporations. We're talking about joint stock companies, the London Company, later known as the Virginia Company. This was a group of men who had some money to burn. Today, we would look at them as guys with a few billion, if you will, the hedge funds people who have money to burn. If they lose it, it's no big deal. And of course, if they win, well, then that's a whole nother status. Today, for example, you have one of the largest lotteries going off in American history. The two lotteries together, well over $1 billion. And if you can afford to lose a dollar, because the odds of you winning are slim and none, but if you can afford to lose a dollar, hey, that dollar might pay off for big, big money. Well, that's what the joint stock companies were. Of course, a little bit more than a dollar was involved, but they're going to be kicking in their money with the idea that, well, it's not all on my back. We're each taking risks here. And if we lose, we lose. And thus, that's how Jamestown is going to be founded. And then some of the ones after that, such as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These were, again, adventures in possibly, and I'm going to underline the word possibly, making big money. If not, well, we didn't lose that much to begin with. The administration of these colonies was as different as the peoples. The Spanish were very controlling from the very beginning. People from the royal court were sent over immediately to supervise and make sure that the treasure got to where it was intended. Whereas with both the British and a little bit with the French, they kind of let the colonists go on their own. They didn't have the money, nor the time, nor the background that the Spanish had in running these colonies. So they gave them a certain amount, which was going to prove to be rather fateful, of independence. And eventually, that was going to prove deadly. The societies were as different as the governments. As you see, about 85% of the Spanish immigrants were male. That's not going to be the case with the British. A lot of interaction and intermarriage with the Spanish and the native women. And then likewise with the African females that are going to come over here, producing an entire new race, if you will, the mestizos. Whereas with the British, not going to be the case. Very little mingling between the societies. And that was going to prove to be a difficulty. This was going to be, during this era, 1630 to 1660, one of the greatest mass migrations in all of human history. As you see there, during that 30-year period, 189,000 people are going to be leaving England. The bulk of them, as you can tell by the screen, going to the West Indies, not to America. They were looking for get rich quick. It was going to be a little bit different in America. And the permanency in the West Indies was not the same as it would be in North America. Settlement life, no matter where you go, it was daunting. The rate of survival was heavily against you. And in the beginning, when they came over here, they were not, particularly the English, were not looking to cultivate crops. They were not farmers. had it not been for their relationship with the Indians, we're talking about the Virginia area now in the South, they would have all died. They relied heavily on the Indians to provide food. And quite honestly, the Indians in the very beginning looked on the English as some type of gods. Uh, they were both going to be roundly disappointed because the Indians got tired of doing all the work, and the English did not behave as if they were gods. And so that was going to lead to some tension and eventually some reactions with both. As you can see, the colonists are looking for valuable commodities, commodities that were in high demand in England. Remember, England is an island, and as such, she relied heavily on what she brought in from overseas. Jamestown, as you can see there, only 60 of the original 500 that came over survived. 60 out of 500. And as you see, some of them even resulted or went to cannibalism. Yeah, not too tasty. We've talked about the lost colony of Roanoke. Sir Francis Drake and others established, and of course, disappeared off the face of the earth. And to this day, nobody has solved the mystery of the lost colony. But that would be followed up with Jamestown, and that was the first permanent foothold that the English established over in America. We're going to now, what you're going to find as they realize, they being the men that came over here, starting with Jamestown and thereafter in that area of America, that to make this pay, it was going to take some heavy labor. And that's not something they were interested in, nor in terms of their numbers capable of carrying out. So they were going to rely on two groups. The first group would be indentured servants. The company would export men from England and later Ireland over to America, both male and female. And again, for 5 to 7 years worth of hard labor. After that, they would be given land with which to begin their own lives with. But the problem with that was they were white. Their benefactors, if you want to call them that, their owners were white. And it was very easy for these individuals to just slip away and never be found again. There will also be another problem in terms of rebellion, but we'll touch upon that a little bit later. So, as you see there, in 1619, the first Africans arrived via Dutch traders. Now, there is debate even to this day as to whether they came over as indentured servants or whether, in fact, they were slaves. But you're going to see by the mid-1600s, laws had been passed in Virginia that made them and their lot in life permanently slaves. And it became more economically sound to invest in slaves rather than indentured servants. Again, for a couple of different reasons. So the slave population grew steadily. In the North, now, was there slavery in New England? Yeah, every state that you can mention, we'll talk about the 13 original colonies, had slavery. Varying degrees of it, and of course, nowhere like the South. Virginia would become later on known as the Queen of the slave states. And you're going to find a large number of slaves in New York State, but not so in Massachusetts or Connecticut. A few individual slaves owned, but because of the geography, because of the environment, it did not pay. And then again, their religion was much less tolerant of slavery than it was down south. But did New England participate in the slave trade? Oh, yeah, very much so. In what later becomes known as the triangular trade. Take a look at the map that you're seeing here. And you'll notice in Africa, you have what became known as various coasts along their west coast. The Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the Diamond Coast. And this area here, as you can see, the Slave Coast. The slave trade, and we'll get into much more detail later on, was conducted by the coastal kings who lived here. They would go into the interior, capture, as it turns out, millions. You can tell by the numbers that you see there in the black boxes. And then they would be shipped over, the bulk of them actually going to Latin America. But as you see, over 500,000 via this triangular trade will make their way into North America. This triangular trade was, again, an extremely important development in the economy of the New World. As you see there in those song lyrics that I took from a play, 1776, from molasses to rum to slaves. Molasses would be taken, all right, converted into rum. The rum would be taken and traded for slaves, and then the slaves would be taken here, exchanged for molasses, and the entire thing would begin again. The triangular trade. This area here, from the Gold Coast, or I should say from the Slave Coast, over to America, this becomes known as the Middle Passage. Now, the English would love to have had the Spanish type of system of government, but again, as you see there, didn't have the money to do it. And they were distracted by other things. So their colonies were granted rather wide latitude, independency, as it was referred to back then. And the colonists, and understandably so, were interested in serving themselves. They were not interested in the mother country. Again, and I can't stress this enough, environment and the surroundings were going to play a huge factor in how they developed. And the old traditions, the old style of life was not going to make it in North America. They had to unlearn things and learn some others. And all this was going to produce something that becomes known as salutary neglect. In other words, the English rulers and Parliament cast a jaundiced look at the New World. They kind of winked and realized, well, they're not paying taxes, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. But again, they didn't have the time nor the money to take care of that. And of course, at that time, they also did not appreciate how valuable these colonies were going to become. Ah, yes, the trick now was enticing people to go over there, because all of these joint stock companies and royal charters that are going to be handed out by the king, in order to make money, they need people. They need people to live there. So the enticement, as you see in this particular post, offering the most excellent fruits by planting in Virginia, exciting all such as be well affected to further the fame. Ah, yes. What you have there then is what are known as push and pull factors. You had things that were over there that were pulling people there, and you had things happening in England and, of course, eventually in the rest of Europe that were pushing them out. So getting rid of and leaving poverty, fear, discrimination, finding safety, opportunity, freedom, all of these things are going to be important in bringing people into the colonies. So, Virginia, Jamestown, settled by the London Company. And the original people over here were gentlemen adventurers who were seeking money. When they first landed, about 5 miles south of where they were supposed to land, if they had traveled a little bit further up the James River, they'd have been in the land of milk and honey. As it was, they land in a rather dismal swamp area infested with mosquitoes and therefore bringing disease and fever and causing a great many deaths. But when they first landed, they weren't interested in anything else but seeking gold. They started filling casks and buckets up with sand, which they thought was gold dust, and sending that back to England. The only thing it was good for was setting up a beach volleyball court in a castle. Anyway, so that's what they were there for. Immediately, what was established was something called the headright system. And for every person that you personally brought over, whether it be an indentured servant, a wife, or another family member, then you were given an additional 50 acres. But of course, keep in mind, as you got more land, that mean or necessitated more labor. And where was that labor going to come from? And of course, eventually we know it's going to be slavery. But what this now produces is a society of self-reliant freemen. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, they couldn't rely on England. I mean, think about it. Forget the distance, all right? The distance was a long way away, but it's not the miles that make a difference, all right? It is the time. It was, in many cases, a 2-month journey, and that's if the weather was good. So if it took 2 months to get there, and then you placed an order for something, 2 months to get back, and then another 2 months to get there, well, as you can see, you needed to rely on yourself. You had to fix your own things. You had to make your own things. You had to govern yourself because, again, because of distance, it creates an independency. So what you're going to have is this labor force comprised of indentured servants and slavery. And eventually it would be almost all slavery. But what it does produce in Virginia is a planter aristocracy. And that aristocracy would rule Virginia for a long, long time. That's not going to be the case necessarily in other colonies. Now, at the bottom of the screen, you see a term there, primogeniture. Primogeniture. That is a custom or a tradition in England and in other parts of Europe, which said that the firstborn male inherits everything from mom and dad. So if you happen to be son number 3 or daughter number 2, whatever the case may be, you get absolutely nothing. Well, if that's the case and you get absolutely nothing, now here is a new world that holds out some type of hope. So that's why these gentlemen adventurers came over here. Jamestown, the original Jamestown, was a rather crude fort. And it's courtesy of Captain John Smith. He said, you either work or starve. Nobody eats unless they work. And to build themselves protection from the Indians, which they eventually ran afoul of, they needed that fort. So what you have in the southern colonies will be a copycat thing. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Georgia somewhat, but Georgia's going to be a little bit different. right? But you're going to have a planter aristocracy. You're going to have the rise of slavery, and to turn a profit, large land holdings that produce eventually tobacco and rice. Now, let's talk about the two Johns. No, we're not talking about bathrooms here. John Smith and John Rolfe. Much of the history and the fantasies, if you will, of life in Virginia centers around those two. John Smith was a mercenary. He had fought all over Europe and in Turkey, and was hired to go over with the colonists, the original ones now, that first landed in Jamestown, in order to provide them with some military protection. We all know the legend of John Smith and Pocahontas, and in fact, it is mostly legend. Pocahontas, at the time that she supposedly saves John Smith's life, was only 11 or 12 years old. There was no romantic interest via the Walt Disney cartoon. John Rolfe, who does eventually marry Pocahontas, is going to produce the gold that they were looking for. But I'm not talking about the gold that you dig out of a mine. I'm talking about a crop, if you will, that produces money. And that crop, of course, was tobacco. Rolfe brings over a strain of tobacco from the Caribbean islands, and it's that which makes Virginia extremely profitable. Rolfe will marry Pocahontas. She eventually, at the age of 21, goes back to England with him and then dies over there from a cold. They now, in Virginia, as they grow in wealth and stature, will again, because of salutary neglect, be forced to rule themselves. They will produce the first democratically, if you will, elected House of Representatives called the House of Burgesses. If you've ever been to Williamsburg down in Virginia, and you go in a big circular brick building, that's where the House of Burgesses met. Let's take a look.
Shiploads of businessmen and true believers. Shiploads of businessmen and true believers are crossing the Atlantic Ocean to create a new world. May 1610, 120 years after Columbus, it's still a perilous journey. One ship, the Deliverance, carries a cargo that will change America forever. On board is John Rolfe, a 24-year-old English farmer, ambitious, self-reliant, visionary, a born entrepreneur. What takes us 6 hours today by plane was then a voyage of more than 2 months. 7 of the early adventurers out of every 10 will be dead within a year. But the risks are worth it. North America is the ultimate land of opportunity. A continent of vast, untapped wealth. Starting with the most valuable resource of all, land.
The most valuable resource of all, land. And to them, it seemed like that land was inexhaustible. There was always more land. The legend was, and with a lot of fact to back it up, that if you took a squirrel and put him at the tip of Florida, he would never touch the ground going all the way up to the tip of Maine. That the forests were so thick, coming right down to the shoreline, that, again, it was going to take a great deal of labor in order to clear that land. Now, besides Virginia, there would be other royal experiments, if you will. Maryland, Sir George Calvert, later known as Lord Baltimore, would be given a land grant by the king as a haven for Catholics. This was a way, of course, that the king was able to get rid of the Catholics, get them out of England. So for a while, this was, as you see on the screen, a Catholic haven. However, as more and more people started to come in, eventually the Catholics realized that they were going to be outnumbered. And so to make sure that they would not be discriminated against, they passed the Act of Religious Toleration in 1649, saying that all religions were welcomed in Maryland and none would be discriminated against by the government. Now, life in the Chesapeake area, most men were dead by the time they reached age 30. Most of them were single. And as such, women became very, very valuable. Tobacco plantations were the main source of wealth. We've already talked about the headright system. 75% of all immigrants into the Chesapeake came over as indentured servants. But now, here's where the problem started, at least in the eyes of the planter aristocracy. Eventually, they were not going to be dependable. And what I mean by that is, we've already talked about the fact that it would be easy for them to just leave and go to another colony and never to be seen again. But for the most part, they stayed because of the promise of land. They would be given anywhere from 50 to 150 acres of land. And then they would start the process all over again. The more people they brought over, more land, et cetera, et cetera. But the land along the valuable coast had already been taken up. So they were pushed further inland. And as such, it's kind of a replication, if you will, of what the planter aristocracy just went through. They left England, put distance between themselves and control. Now you've got the freed indentured servants going inland, putting distance between them and the governing bodies, so they become independent, but they still rely upon the government for protection. And that reliance was going to lead to something known as Bacon's Rebellion. And what this involved was the individuals on the inland were being harassed by Indians. They wanted government protection. The problem was that the governor of Virginia, Governor Berkeley, had a rather lucrative trading agreement with the Indians. So he didn't provide any protection. Eventually, Nathaniel Bacon would lead the inland planters to Jamestown. They would burn Jamestown down, chase the governor, and the rebellion would have been successful had not Nathaniel Bacon died of disease. And of course, eventually the rebellion petered out. But this established in the uppermost minds of the planter aristocracy that they don't want to bring any more indentured servants over, and would lead to a greater reliance on slavery. Say, take a look at the map, and you can see there the area settled by 1650 was all along the rivers and the coastline. 1700, much more deeply in, and again reliant for protection from Jamestown. Eventually Williamsburg becomes the capital, but they didn't get it, and that was going to lead, as you see there, 1676 to Bacon's Rebellion. Irony is 100 years later, same thing. So this is what the Southern society looked at. Plantation owners at the top, slaves at the bottom. Ironically, landless whites and indentured servants should have had a great deal in common with the slaves, but they were sold a bill of goods by the plantation owners that as long as the slaves were at the bottom of the pyramid, then that made them, the landless whites and the indentured servants, worth something. It was something they could aspire to. So that's going to lead us to New England. We'll stop here. You'll get part two of this explanation of colonization very, very shortly.